Now let's look at fundamental test process. When you want to test, what are those essential things that are required? We are discussing planning, and which will involve specification, execution, recording, and check completion. Test planning. In anything you want to do, of course, planning is involved. So also in software testing, planning is involved. And this way you determine everything, like I said earlier, that you're going to do or that will be involved in the testing. So it will be documented, and then you follow it accordingly as in a project. How the test strategy and project test plan apply to the software under test. So respective software will have different plan depending on the specification. So you document any exceptions to the test strategy. For example, only one test case design technique needed for this functional area because it is less critical. But where you have some other things to consider, you may have to increase it. Other software needed for the test, perhaps you will require a software to test your application, so you determine it, or even the infrastructures that may be needed. So other software such as stubs and drivers, and the environment details such. And then you also set the test completion criteria such that when you meet up with the criteria, you can consider your test to have been completed. Now let's look at the specification. In specification, we are going to identify conditions, design test cases, and build test. Now a good test case should be effective, evolvable, and economic. So for it to be effective, you should be able to find fault. Where your test case is not able to find fault, is not effective. Evolvable, where it is easy to maintain. As we are going to see later, we will discuss about keeping records of test scripts that could be used for automation or regression tests. It should also be cheap to use. Let's look at test specification. Test specification can be broken down into distinct tasks. It will involve identifying, designing, and building your test. You identify what is to be tested, the test conditions, what is it that you want to check, especially against the specification, like I said, as defined in your software requirements, and prioritize. Determine how the what that you have identified earlier is to be tested, that is, you design the test cases. Then you implement the test, the data and the scripts and everything that has been identified earlier. So the first task is to identify the conditions, to determine what is to be tested and prioritize. Then you list the conditions that we would like to test, you prioritize the test, and must ensure most important conditions are covered. When we're talking about exhaustive testing earlier, we made mention of this. So like I said earlier, again, the second task was to design the test cases, determine how what you have identified earlier is to be tested. You design the test input and the test data, the test conditions. We are talking about the test conditions this time around. Then you determine the expected conditions. You predict what the outcome of each test case should be. What is the output when you enter your data or the script, the conditions, what you expect the result to be, what is changed and what is not changed. Then you design the set of tests, the different test sets for different objectives such as regression, building confidence, and finding fault. So you design those set of tests. In building your test, you prepare the test scripts. Less system knowledge tester has more detailed scripts. and we have to be scripts for tools have to specify every details. Then you prepare the test data, the data that must exist in files and databases at the start of each test. Again, you prepare the expected result. It should be defined before the test is executed, and this is determined from the specification. Where you have your requirement, in the specification, in the requirement, you have what your software is supposed to be doing. That is the expected result. Any deviation from that, of course, during the course of your test, is a failure. Let's look at execution. In execution, you execute the prescribed test cases as you have determined earlier, as has been determined earlier. You execute those test cases, and just like we're talking about prioritization, it is the most important ones that you execute first. You will not execute all test cases if testing only fault fixes, if too many faults found by early test cases. You will not execute all test cases. And if the time pressure, you can see that the time pressure is always recurring, and that's where we talk about prioritization. Now, execution of test cases can be performed manually or automated. Manually, you enter the script, you follow the scripts one after the other. In automation, you use a tool or you use a software, like I said earlier, in carrying out those tests, those conditions that have been determined. Recording, like I said earlier, is necessary for the purpose of regression or even for automation. So the test record contains the identities and version of software under test, the test specifications. Then you also follow the plan. You mark off progress on test scripts. You are recording your progress. You document actual outcomes as compared with your expected result from the test. You capture any other ideas you have for new test cases. Perhaps you might want to, you got new ideas from the existing test cases. You know that these records are used to establish that all test activities have been carried out as specified. In test recording also, we compare actual outcome with expected outcome. So I've said earlier, and where there are discrepancies, you log it. This is where faults are found. If there are discrepancies between the actual outcome and the expected result. So you log discrepancies accordingly. It becomes software fault. You test the fault, expected results is wrong, the environment or version fault, then test run incorrectly. You also log coverage levels achieved for measures specified as test completion criteria. After the fault has been fixed, you repeat the required test activities. You execute, design, and plan in that order. As in, you repeat the required test activities. You are retesting. Then you check the completion. At this time, you are rounding up your test. Test completion criteria were specified in the test plan as discussed earlier. While designing your test plan, you set a test completion criteria such that when you meet up with this criteria, it is assumed that your test has been completed. If not met, you need to repeat test activities, as in the test specifications, to design more tests. The test completion criteria, what is it? How will it come up? Completion and exit criteria apply to all levels of testing to determine when to stop. And in this case, we are talking about the coverage using a measurement technique. And what are these measurements you are going to use? Branch coverage for you for unit testing. Have you covered all areas? User requirements, as in the requirement specification. the SRS or BRD or whatever name that it may be called. Most frequently used transactions, where you are prioritizing, you look at most frequently used transactions. It could serve as a completion criteria where you are during your test planning. Faults found, then the cost or time. So let's look at all of these tasks. Let's compare a comparison of all of these tasks from planning to specification to executing and recording. You have more, the more you go into all of these tasks, the less the intellectual work. So you have more of the intellectual work at the beginning of your activities, but then you have more of clerical work as you proceed, and that is why automation becomes necessary, like we're going to see. Where you have activities repeated so many times and they are recorded, it is good to automate, so the human effort or human input is reduced when you automate. So the intellectual work is a one-off activity and it governs the quality of text. Thank you.